Hey woodworkers, I want to do a little introduction on routers. That's what these things are. It's not routers, it's not just for internet access anymore. These are one manufacturer, there are many. The things that I look for with routers if I'm looking to buy these, two things. Number one is how much metal is going into this versus plastic. More metal here goes a long way. The other thing is how much power is going to be into this motor, and it's a little misleading because most of the power ratings that tool manufacturers provide are based on horsepower, and there's all kinds of ways to massage those numbers, but what they can't massage is the overall amperage on the amount of power that these things pull. So there's always going to be a little plate back here, model number, so on and so forth, and 120 volts, 9 amps for this one, which is great. This one, this is telling us that we've got 10 amps. So we've got 1 amp of difference between the two. So not a lot to worry about, but as long as it's a little bit higher up or closer to double digits, as much power as I can possibly get is typically optimal for a lot of heavy cuts where the bit is going to be engaged on both sides or on 3 of the sides. If I'm just doing cleaning up of edges and that sort of thing or creating a round over, then these would be overpowered, and that's great. Then I would start thinking about what's comfortable to hold, and yeah, so on and so forth. So the other categorization of routers is if it's a fixed base or a plunge base router, and these are 2 examples of plunge base routers, and what that means is that if I have a bit in place and I'm ready to start engaging to the cut, there's this little lever on this particular router that gets released. I can plunge into the depth that I need, and I can lock this back in with this lever, go about my routing. Then when I'm done with the cut, release this lever, and then there's a spring in here that kind of wants to bring it back up. There are positions here where you can engage this little rod, and then as this is plunged to a depth, it'll engage onto one of these stops. This could be, oops, this little platform here could be moved to different locations. And there's a fine tune or a fine adjust on this one by threading the thing in. This also has threads on this as well, so you can do a lot of fine tuning. Alright, so that's how this one works. Same concept here, although the plunge features are in a different location. This is done with the left hand, so if I loosen up this knob, this is free to plunge, and then I can lock it in with just holding my hand on this knob. Some people really prefer this location. Some think this is too easily jostled or knocked loose as you're cutting, and then so this bit could start to come up or come down if you don't have a stop set. So either one of these things work. The other option for router bases is going to be a fixed base, as I mentioned. With a fixed base, it is a lot more work to move the bit down to the proper depth for whatever it is you're cutting. Typically that means that there's a little collar. Sorry, there's a little collar. This little collar here, I would have to loosen this thing up, and then I would rotate the motor basically in and out. There are these fairly aggressive threads on the interior of this, and then lock this in a position. And so you could still adjust the depth on a fixed base router, but it's just a lot more work, and you lose the ability for most applications to have a stop at a fixed location. This is a long way around explaining that I think a plunge router gets you the ability to go to a specific depth while that bit is engaged, while that's rotating. Whereas a fixed base, you have to turn the machine off, dial this thing in, and then lock it in, then start the cut again with whatever you're doing. This one, I forget what I have this in. I think it's in my router table. That must be it. But this thing goes in, and then it no longer needs this little fixed base. So, all right. So that's big strokes about differences of these things. When looking into routers, typically the ones that have more power, more metal, so a higher end routing option, has two different sizes of these, which are referred to as collets. This is the wrong one. Oh, there we are. So collets are the things that hold the router bits themselves. Bear with me one second. Okay. So typically these collets come in two different diameters, and they're set to fit for the two most common shank sizes of router bits, and that's the 1/4 inch and then the 1/2 inch. And so typically 1/4 inch are a little bit less expensive. They're less material going into this thing. I prefer 1/2 inch router bits whenever I possibly can, and the reason for it is when this goes into the thing that's going to hold this into the router itself, there's just so much more surface area that this is holding into. It creates a better bond or grab of what it is you're going to start holding. 1/4 inch bits are great. There's nothing wrong with them, except for the fact that with less clamping area around that circumference, as you're really driving this thing into the cut, sometimes you overdrive, which means that you're pushing faster than this bit can clear chips, and then it starts to create small vibrations, and the small vibrations are going to cause this thing to come loose. It rarely comes all the way out and disengages from the collet, but it can make a huge difference if you have all of this set up to a specific depth. Vibration will drop this thing down 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 inch, and then at that point maybe you're pushing through the other face of the board. So just be cautious about how much you're asking of this bit to do, and how quickly you're kind of driving or forcing this through the cut you want to make. Alright, so I don't need those. What I am going to do is mount one of these bits into the router. And I'm going to use this one just because I think it might be a little bit easier to see. So routers will come with 2 wrenches typically, and the reason for that is that you have the collet here, and I'm going to set up for using this bit. So the 1/2 inch bit that I'm putting into here, I don't know if you can see this from the camera, but the length of this shank that we're using, I want to make sure that that goes all the way through the end of this collet. So for example, if I were to drive this thing in, and so in the center of this, the bit is not fully engaged into this full length, which means that I have less material holding this bit into place. So I don't have as good of a grip here, and people think gaining a little bit extra length in this bit by kind of teeing this up higher is a good option, and unfortunately it's a bad trade-off, just because the vibration here is really going to start to amplify if I start to cut in this manner. So what I want to do is make sure that the bit is all the way past the end of this collet, and so if I've done that, there's a great connection, great hold here, and so I'm in good shape. If I were to extend this bit even further, I really don't gain any strength in this location, and actually this could get worse as I tighten this into the router, because the bit itself could bottom out inside of where this thing holds, and then it becomes trickier to get out, and you start needing to strike your bit to kind of draw it loose, which is never a fun thing to do. So as much as I can, I just want to have this all the way through the collet. This one is really tight, but that's about where I want it to be. Alright, so that's what this thing looks like. Now, in tightening this thing in, let me get the threads engaged. And you'll see the reason for having two wrenches here. One wrench is going to hold the threaded side, or the spindle, against the router, and that's going to allow me to just tighten or loosen our collet. And so once I'm here, I want to start really putting some pressure into this. Most of the time when we're talking about woodworking tools, we talk about gentle pressure and all that. I really start to dial this thing in and go crazy with putting pressure on this. The thing that you probably noticed when I was tightening this is I had my wrenches so I can grip these in one hand and kind of squeeze them closed. I've seen so many people when they start to do woodworking, they hold wrenches in two hands and then they start to squeeze together, and then eventually what happens is one of these has to give way, and then it loosens up, and then you jam them against your knuckles, and then people say, hey, what happened to your knuckles? Did you get into a fight, car accident, something along those lines? And they said, no, just woodworking. And so just be careful about what it is or how you're tightening these things. One hand grip and a couple of times, and that'll get you dialed in. With this particular style of router, it only comes with one wrench. Oh, sounds like my brushes are getting low. Alright, so I have my collet in place. Let's pretend there was a bit. So this is the wrench that goes with it, but there's no flat spots here on the spindle to lock this thing in. It does come with the next best thing, which is this little button here, which will allow me to continue to tighten. It'll lock that spindle into place, and I can really wrench this thing in. I feel like these are a little bit more convenient, because instead of those two wrenches that you're messing with, it's just the one. And then same deal when we take the bit out, push this button down, and then reverse in the same way. So those are the two features with this. Alright, I think that's everything we need to talk to you about routers, or routing. What I need to do now is set a specific depth. And so what I've done here is I've dropped the bit to the maximum depth that it can go to right now, which is in line with the base. And there are different base things that you can add to create different thickness on this, but what I'm really trying to do with this base is to extend the width of the metal base and then this universal base here, because I've got a jig that I need to use this for, and this is too small. So what I would do, I would screw this base into place, I would drop this thing down, and then I need to set the depth that I want to plunge into the workpiece. And there's two ways I could do that. I think the simplest way here is to measure the distance between this rod and when it locks down onto this spot. And if I've done this, then it will continue to find that spot every single time, and that's what I want to do. Once I'm there, then I can lock this thing in. But what I need to look for is this is now set up for going to the very bottom of that universal base. So what I need to do from here is I bottom this thing out, and I will now need to add additional gap between this little rod and that stop. So I'll lock this thing in. I'm going to measure. This is fussy. This is maybe why I don't love this feature. Alright, I think that's about where I want to be. Yeah, alright, so that'll work. There's not a good way to get this set up accurately. I know a lot of people have, well, I should say a lot of companies sell little spacer blocks that are machined to specific thicknesses. So 1/4 inch, 5/16, 3/8, so on and so forth. And then what you can do is just slip this in between these 2 points. Do it again, these 2 points, and then bring them together, and then now you've got your final depth. I've really never been motivated to purchase those tools, but I do kind of like what they offer. What I have done instead, if I'm going for a fixed depth, is do my best to set this thing up. And I will use a board. I don't know if you could see this, but I'll measure off from here to whatever my final depth needs to be. This is 3/8 of an inch. And then if I've done this correctly, which I have not. Oh, that's right. Then I can lower this bit just a little bit until I get down to my final depth. Oops. This is as awkward as it should look on camera, but it works, and my line is pretty close to where I need to be, so that's what I'm going to do. So once I have that position there, I'll bring this rod all the way down in the same way that we talked about, and then every single time that I'm making these cuts, I can expect, once I plunge this thing down, to find my final depth. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. Yeah, that's all there is. Thank you so much.